Has affirmative responded? Good. Pragyan, have you received a confirmation from affirmative, or do we proceed?
Yeah, I have consent. Yeah.
Wonderful. So I can go forward then. Hey folks, welcome to round 7 of Nepal Australs 2021. My name is Chinmay Mohan. I'll be your chair for this round. No preferred gender pronouns for me. Could have my fellow judge introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, I'm Shreya Harlapur. I'll be the panelist today. My preferred pronouns are she, her, they, but you can refer to us as panel, and all the best for today's debate.
Wonderful. And as Shreya mentioned, although you're now privy to our names and preferred gender pronouns, it's just best if you refer to us collectively and as a whole. Cool. I think everyone's familiar with the drill. If you could move forward with the verbal introductions, just as always with preferred gender pronouns, it's entirely up to your discretion if you wish to disclose them. It's perfectly chill if you don't. If ever you're uncertain of anyone's preferred gender pronouns, just defer to gender neutral pronouns or their speaker positions. Cool. Affirmative, if you'd be so kind as to introduce yourselves.
Hello, Nayara going first, she, her, they, them.
Sajid going second in reply, no preferences.
Sourodip going third, no preference.
Wonderful. If you'd also be so kind as to remind me of your motion veto. Never mind. We can also have that from negative.
We vetoed the third motion.
Wonderful. Negative, if you'd be so kind as to introduce yourselves.
Hey, my name's Lulu. I'm speaking first, and my preferred pronouns are she, her. Conna speaking second, she or they.
Jacky third, he, they, and we vetoed motion A, just to confirm.
Wonderful. No, I remember. I've got that. Also negative, if you've already decided who's giving the reply, let me know. Otherwise, you can also decide after the third speech. Either way works.
Sorry, just to be clear, Conna speaking reply. Second.
Yeah. Understood. Understood. Cool. I think that takes care of just about everything. One quick request. Shreya, would you be all right with sending timestamps in the chat?
Yeah, I can do that.
Wonderful. So just because I can't because of certain device constraints, we will of course have timestamps in the chat courtesy Shreya. However, that notwithstanding, everyone is strongly encouraged to time themselves just so that y'all can all stay responsible for your own time. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the drill, so I think we can just get going. Debating on the second motion that Western powers should pressure Ethiopia to allow Tigray to secede, context slide attached. Wonderful. If you can now invite first affirmative to open the case side F. Sure.
Hello, can you hear and see me?
Yeah, all good. Whenever you're ready.
Great. If I cut off at any point in time, just feel free to interrupt me and let me know that you can't hear me. Other than that, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What exactly do we mean when we say we're going to pressurize Ethiopia? A couple of things. Number one, we can input diplomatic pressure on them from the West or to organizations like the UN and UNSC. In terms of that, we can exert pressure through coalitions, etc. Number two, we can implement selective sanctions on key government officials or military officials. An analogy would be similar to the Myanmar and sanctioning specific military individuals who are taking part in the Rohingya genocide. Number three, if required, we can increase the pressure depending on the escalation of the conflict. We aren't absolutely rigid, so we can change policies depending on how the conflict escalates or doesn't escalate. Great, so let's do some context setting at first. Number one, we think that the Tigray claim to sovereignty is legitimate for a couple of reasons. The government that controls them is illegitimate because Abiy Ahmed's government was essentially elected in an illegitimate election. And upon that election, they cut TPLF off completely from all forms of positions of power. Number two, most of the individuals in the, most Tigray individuals actively want that autonomy and separate statehood and are actively fighting for it. We think that they deserve to be separate because of things like different identities, different cultural values, also because of the fact that they're actively oppressed and targeted and are victims of state-sanctioned violence against them. And they're unable to defend themselves because they literally don't have any political voice or political power. This is the only way in which they can get that power back. That is why they deserve to be separate. Great. What we have to prove in this debate is that this is the only thing that can happen. There are no alternatives. alternatives and why this is likely to work. So let's prove why we can actually pressurize Ethiopia into doing this. A couple of reasons behind why, right? Number one, we think that Ethiopia largely is a nationalized economy, which means it is easier for us to selectively target the state, because when you sanction an economy that is a large chunk of whom is dependent on the state, we think it can hurt the government, which means then you can force them to do things that you want them to do as a result of that sanctions. Number two, Abiy Ahmed himself said that he would do privatization in the future and has favor because of his economic policies. If individuals see that Abiy Ahmed is unable to uphold his end of the bargain, which got him elected in the first place, which were his economic promises, we think that he loses that political will from the individuals who support them. Number three, we think that the conflict persisting despite pressure is a result of elite support that currently exists. And we think that that elite support is also something that can go away once they see, we can selectively target those elite individuals once we implement our policies. And we think that they can also withdraw that support once they see that there's significant pressure through things like sanctions, etc. Number four, we think that the West is one of the biggest allies of Ethiopia right now. So USA, for instance, imports a lot, like about 20% of Ethiopia's exports, etc. So even if Ethiopia itself is not an ally of the West can selectively use their alliance with unions like the African Union because of like countries like Kenya, Nigeria, etc., and have them all on their side. So we think this is something that is likely to work because the West can exert influence through other allies like the African Union. Great. So let's talk about why there are actually no alternatives. The premise of this is that the relationship between the TPLF and Ethiopia is actually irreparably damaged for a couple of reasons. But we also think that currently there is a military deadlock because the Tigray individuals also have some levels of power. And here is why. Number one, because the TPLF had actually ruled Ethiopia 3 decades prior to Abiy Ahmed's elections, they actually had strategically placed members in all top positions of power. So there are military trained individuals. They have individuals with money. They also have the largest amount of individuals in Ethiopian special forces that existed, which means these are individuals who know how to fight and they know how to specifically go on in terms of conflict because they were trained to do that. Number two, what exactly did Abiy Ahmed do after winning elections? He disbanded the old coalition, which TPLF was a part of. That is why they were forced to withdraw. And then he removed individuals from positions of power. That did not take away the resentment that they have for the government. And it did not take away the training that they received with regards to how to fight in wars when crisis like that happens. Which means then what you are left with are individuals who have a lot of resentment towards the government. Number three, we think that TPLF had won majority elections in the Tigray region anyway, but Abiy Ahmed considered it to be illegitimate. As a result of that, the political voices they otherwise could have had legitimately through votes was also taken away from them. All of this analysis means there is pent-up frustration because Abiy Ahmed, because the Abiy Ahmed government in particular disproportionately affected and disproportionately harmed the TPLF and Tigray individuals as well. There's a lot of frustration that is not going to go away. But more than that, these are individuals who still have their power and still have their money and still have that training, which means this conflict is going to continue unless there is somebody that acts as an external force that exerts pressure. But here's the thing, right? The point of this conflict is that the Tigray individuals want independence. Unless some form of a secession is met, they have the ability to keep on continuing that conflict to begin with, which is why any alternatives won't work because what they want is independence and they're going to seek that regardless. All right. So let's talk about the best case scenario of like neg. If they push, essentially, there are alternatives that can work and you don't essentially have to pressurize them to secede. Maybe you can give them separate autonomy or like any forms of like any other alternative, why that can't work. A couple of reasons. Number one, we think that the Tigray individuals will never be helped under the Abiy Ahmed administration for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because he has an incentive to cater to his own political party and the elites, he's always going to do things like give the Tigray individuals like less power within the government if he ever agrees to give them power to begin with. But he's also going to do things like disproportionately displace them from their areas because he wants to make it easier for he wants to appeal to the elites who brought him in power. And a lot of those individuals essentially don't want the Tigray individuals to be in positions of power. As a result of this, he's going to do things like forced displacement and force individuals to move out of Ethiopia into bordering countries, hence escalating the already existing border crisis that exists there. Secondly, we think that a lot of the welfare that these individuals achieve, because Ethiopia is a landlocked state, but also because currently the government in place has the ability to give you state, because welfare essentially is in the hands of the state. Any aid that comes from places like Western countries, which could potentially run like USA, is essentially a strategy that they use because they block that aid, which is used essentially in warfare. This means that the government is like intentionally blocking a humanitarian, etc., aid from going through to these individuals, which means they have no ability to further defend themselves. Lastly, we think that there are a lot of economic issues within Ethiopia in general, and obviously because of the conflict, individuals are dying, etc. Why is all of this analysis important? Because it shows to you right now that because there's a disproportionate harm that has been inflicted upon especially the Tigray individuals who literally have not had a political voice and a capacity to defend themselves on that front, they not only deserve this, they not only deserve secession, but also that these individuals have the means to continue fighting unless they get that secession. All of this analysis then tells you no alternative form of policy is actually going to help out. Why? Because even if there was some negotiation that could exist, which could potentially halt the conflict, the root cause of the conflict is something that still stands, which is hostility and an irreparable damage between the two political parties that we're trying to talk about. As a result of this, unless the Tigray individuals get secession, and unless they get complete autonomous control and secession, there are means and there is an incentive to keep the conflict going. As a result of this, no alternatives can ever work. We are proud to affirm.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the first affirmative speaker for that fine speech. I'd now like to invite the first negative speaker to open the case side. Nick. Here.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. There are two considerations you need to apply to this affirmative team's claim that the will of Tigrayans is for succession. The first is that desire for secession is driven by an underlying desire for more autonomy and power. That desire can be placated in other ways once this area has returned to normalcy and in ways that do not reward violence. Secondly, those people, in the interests of their own personal security, do not want a violent and militaristic TPLF that has just been fighting a violent revolutionary fight to have a monopoly on the power vacuum that would occur if secession was granted in the way this affirmative team wants it to be. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, on setup. Secondly, on why Ethiopia is likely to regain Tigray. This argument is quite important because it would suggest that the trajectory of the status quo is for Ethiopia to regain Tigray, meaning that the West has a very small timescale on which it could act at all. And the last thing I'm going to do is explain why this would be a bad outcome for the world if, in fact, this pressure did work. Firstly, on setup. What do we think this pressure looks like? The first thing we need to understand is that Iran is the country who is supplying arms to the TPLF. That is to say, the West can threaten all it wants to impose arms embargoes, but those are empty threats. They do not have influence over Iran. This pressure probably looks like economic sanctions. It looks like freezing assets. It probably looks like carrot and stick diplomacy. It looks like diplomatic isolation. It looks like conditional aid being given by development banks. That conditional aid could be matched by China if the West took this course of action. And those forms of economic violence that I have just mentioned are things that are likely to harm people in ways that do not particularly affect the government. That is because political and economic elites are shielded from the agrarian economy, which would feel the impact of these sanctions. That is because the mechanism of sanctions is a war of attrition tactic that is likely to make people particularly angry, and angry in ways that are easily able to be weaponized by the by actors in this region. Second point of setup is the power that the Ethiopian government has over the narrative around this conflict. They have media influence, they have popular support because they are seen as the legitimate sovereign by 93% of the Ethiopian population, and because they are seen as a desirable political actor because they support a norm of religious diversity, which is not what the TPLF do. Also, Ethiopia has not been colonized in the same way other countries in the region have, meaning that anti-colonialism is a particularly important part of its national identity. And so the optics of this, which are very colonial, is likely to be something that is, seen as very bad in the eyes of the Ethiopian people. Why is it that Ethiopia is likely to regain control of Tigray? A few reasons. One, we think that the Ethiopian government has control of the Tigrayan capital. It holds that capital by force. That would suggest that the central Ethiopian government has a separate and far more modern and stronger military than that of the TPLF, who has literally failed to break the blockade that is slowly starving their people. Secondly, we think that the government has very successfully imposed a blockade on food and medical supplies, which means that this region is subject to dwindling resources and the populace is increasingly becoming unhappy as their rights are not being met. The third thing we would say is that the Ethiopian government has been quite successful in cutting off access to neighbors that could be sympathetic. The fourth thing we would say is that the people in Tigray are vastly outnumbered by the people who are in Ethiopia, but not in Tigray. That is, Tigrayans make up 7% of Ethiopia. The fifth reason we would say that Ethiopia is likely to regain Tigray is because the Ethiopian army is increasingly using modern warfare, such as unmanned drones, which it is buying from Turkey and China. All this is to say that the West has a very small time scale on which any actions could be effective. That means that it would tend towards violence or very, very, heavy forms of economic violence that are likely to make it look legitimate and not like a good actor in this situation. But even if you don't believe that, why is it that Ethiopia does not want to give up Tigray? That is to say, why would they fight back hard and in ways that are particularly likely to succeed against this Western pressure? Firstly, we think that Ethiopia realizes that it is really important to have control of Tigray. That is because there is currently a conflict in the region over the Nile River. Egypt and other countries need to use this river to drink water, and what the TPLF wants to do is use this for hydropower. It is particularly important that the government is able to control Tigray, because if Egypt, who is supporting the TPLF, is able to get control in this area, that is an attack on their national security. They obviously care about the Nile River, and the PM has already declared victory over this area. There are very, very high political costs for Ethiopia to, giving this up. That means they fight back hard and in ways that are likely to make Western pressure not successful. Let's talk now about why applying this pressure would be bad in the event that it actually does work out. Firstly, we think you create grounds that are ripe for proxy war. That is bad for the world. That is bad for a world which is subject to an accelerating conflict between the US and China. That is destructive. That makes everyone's lives more complicated. Secondly, we think that it inflames Western tensions with Iran. That is, the West and Iran do not like each other, and Iran is backing Ethiopia. So things that are bad for Ethiopia are things that Iran won't like. That is going to make life for the West and others in the Middle East pretty hard. Thirdly, we think this is likely to be something that emboldens Egypt, if in fact it does work. And we think that this is likely to lead to the West having less bargaining power on other issues that are important. We think that the West should be pressuring Ethiopia, probably not to drain the Nile for hydropower, and to come to a more equitable agreement about how that water should be used. It should be giving aid to do, giving aid to enable Ethiopia to do desalination as an export. There is an opportunity cost to using political capital in this way, and it would be far better spent resolving the water issue that is likely to lead to a humanitarian crisis in this area. this water issue is likely to lead to death, destruction, and poverty and suffering on the Horn of Africa. In this speech, what I have done is explain why the trajectory of the status quo is leading towards the Ethiopian federal government regaining control of Tigray. That suggests the West needs to act very quickly and very heavily if it is to have any chance of succeeding. That would mean that those actions would likely be violent, and they would likely be things that are perceived as being particularly inhumane and illegitimate, and things that are likely to draw China or another regional power kind of into replying. I've also explained why it is in the interest of the Ethiopian government not to give this area up, and thus why they would fight back hard even if they weren't, in control of Tigray, as it were. I've also explained why it would be particularly bad if this pressure did work, and if in fact Tigray did succeed. And for those reasons, you ought to award this debate to the negative.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the first negative speaker for that fine speech. I'd now like to invite the second affirmative speaker to continue and extend the case to side F. Rachel. Actually, just a moment before second affirmative, my apologies. There seems to be now an observer in the room that wasn't there earlier. Since all of you consented to being streamed, I assume you all would now be okay with the observer as well, but just to highlight it.
No issues on our end.
Yeah. Negative, real quick. Seems perfunctory, but
Yes, sorry. Yes, we're fine
Yeah,
with
we're
that.
all right with that.
Yeah.
Perfect. My apologies. Wonderful.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I'll discuss is why this will work, and we will give Tigrayan people an independent state. And the reason is because I think NEG concedes that the fundamental desires of the Tigrayan people, which is emancipation and autonomy and the ability to govern for themselves, or more fundamentally, the fundamental needs of a human being, which is to not get oppressed, are something that they want for the Tigrayan people. The first thing I'd like to posit in the strategy that they respond to is, we can't pressure Iran. On a fundamental level, we don't want to. The pressure we want to put on is the Ethiopian state, the other side, so that they stop the aggression. And if your own analysis is that Iran's pressure is not working because it's losing territory to Ethiopia, like surely Iran is not an important actor in the debate by your own analysis because they're losing the fight regardless. But we don't think they are. And that's more fundamental. The more fundamental attack is sanctions affect people on the ground, and therefore they harm the people of Tigray more. The first thing we ended up putting to you is that the sanctions will be on the Ethiopian government, which means, especially when it's a government that is largely based on the public sector, because Ethiopia hasn't privatized yet and 50 to 60% of the economy is state-owned, we're far more able to track government elites and them and make sure that we selectively target them and their bank accounts and freeze their assets rather than the people on the ground. And we're more able to do this because state actors are more dependent on international relationships than private actors who can hide their money in offshore accounts. Number two, let's compare, like even if people suffer, and we already accept the status quo is that the Tigrayan people are suffering by virtue of oppression, and NEG analyzes that for us. We make the people of Ethiopia suffer simultaneously. Why is this suffering comparatively more useful? It's regrettable, of course. We don't want innocent civilians to suffer. But at a point of suffering, when you as an individual know you're in power and you've already elected a government that is looking after your welfare, when you don't have food and your children aren't getting education, your fundamental response is to stop that suffering outright. But when you're in a position when your sovereignty is under attack, you feel you're being oppressed, your land is being taken away from you, and you feel your identity is under attack, your response to suffering is continuing the war, potentially even killing yourself in the name of that identity that you need to protect. What this means is when both sides suffer, the Tigrayan people don't end up giving up that fight and want to continue the conflict, which is the status quo. But when we make the people of the, Ethiopia at large suffer because they're in a position of power, they're more likely to pressurize their government into ending the conflict so they can go back to normal life. So if these people suffer in the process, it's something that will resolve the conflict more quickly. So a comparison of suffering is something that was needed. They then assert a bunch of facts, honestly, which is Ethiopia is largely gaining back territory. They're doing things like blockades, which are successful, which I'm presuming they read in an article. There's some fancy weapon, modern warfare stuff. So we have less time to act. Let's respond to this structurally. The first is this conflict is unlikely to end. And the reason is because the suffering of innocent civilians in Tigray, we've already analyzed why that only emboldens their strive for their identity even further. But let's say these people settle, even if the Tigrayans just want to end this war is propagated by those who were previously in power from the Tigray ethnicity for 27 years that are currently deprived of that power. These are likely to be elites, individuals who want to gain back positions in the military and want to gain back control of the country. So even if people are suffering by virtue of all the blockades and modern warfare, in your best case, the conflict won't end because it's perpetuated by a more privileged group who wants to gain back power. Number two, it is unlikely that all of these military tactics are true. And the reason is because guerrilla warfare within the Tigray region benefits the Tigrayan population. This is because despite the number of forces that you have or the money you have, the nature or the land that you're trying to acquire is one that these people end up living in. So they get the benefits of doing things like knowing high terrains, understanding how military tactics operate in their better. They also have 27 years of experience of defending themselves that has worked. This is why they've regained control of Tigray and are making sure they regain territory in the modern context, which they would know if they actually read facts. Their facts are lies. Number three, this is bad for the Tigrayan people. And the reason is because we think that even if this is true, which is Ethiopia gets back power, our first affirmative has already analyzed you why that is not going to stop the oppression on the Tigrayan people at any point. If anything, it's only going to escalate it further. The first reason for this is because there's existing frustrations with the current conflict that has happened that these people from the Omoro or Amharas that are part of the majority want to exact on the Tigrayan people as revenge. So conflicts happen on the ground, which empower the proxy wars that you're talking about. Number two, there are reasons why the Abiy Ahmed, assuming he gains back control of the region, will want to use that as a political sell. So he's likely to, do things like displace people from land, perpetuate the blockade of aid, and make sure they suffer if this land is under his control. So all of that potentially means that your harms continue on the most vulnerable group. On the flip, we think this pressure, even if they don't get secession, makes them agree to certain things that represent that secession in the status quo. So things like autonomous control of your region while still being part of the same state. Things like ability to have control over what kind of economic policies happen, the resource allocation, all of those things that they're likely to agree to. If we pressurize them for a secession, at least they'll represent some bits of it in the worst case in what they eventually agree to. That's something that they absolutely did not respond to. I just want to directly respond to two ridiculous things they said. Number one, something Nile, Egypt. Guys, the Nile comes to the Gamuz region of Ethiopia, which is in the east. The Tigray region is in the north. They don't have a border with Egypt. That's not something that is true. Number two, conflicts and proxy wars. I think there are two responses to this. First, when you're two separate states, because we've already proven that this secession is likely to be successful, when you have separate borders as separate nations, you're more able to control the influence that or the conflict that happens there because there's less ability for the oppressor to hide information from the international community. So the UN knows that there's an aggressor state and has policies in place to defend nations that are under attack. Number two, regional actors care about borders a lot more. This is because when a new state is created, there's a new set of foreign policy relationships, new economies that are dependent on them. So when these borders are broken, the regional actors that are simultaneously close to them are likely to care about it more than they do right now, because it's a civilian conflict that they don't need to care about because they only interact with the Ethiopian government right now. All of that means even if proxy wars happen, it's worse on their side. The point of material I'd like to posit is, I think it is in the incentive of Abiy Ahmed to allow this secession to happen. This is potentially debate breaking. The reason is because who ultimately makes the decision on why this secession ultimately? It is the people in power, namely Abiy Ahmed. There are reasons why Abiy Ahmed might want to benefit the people. And that's mostly to control, keep control of the government and make sure he extends his position of power even further. But you know what? Another way of doing that is making sure his biggest opponents are no longer fighting against him. Currently, because of 27 years of power, the Tigrayan people have people in positions of power that don't just live in Tigray, but also live in other regions that Abiy Ahmed has currently contested elections in and won. But if he fails, these are likely to be his biggest opponents in the future. Why does a secession solve that? The reason is because these Tigrayan people now know that is the state they have to go to. So a large slunk of them end up moving to that country instead of staying here and fighting for this power. Number two, for the very reasons Op says, there are media organizations that are under control of Abiy Ahmed. So he can flip it as, we got rid of the infidels and let them live alone. We'll have a much better state that we can govern for ourselves without the worry of these Tigrayan people influencing us. So their analysis of media power helps Abiy Ahmed get rid of his biggest opponents. That's also why this secession will happen and these Tigrayan people will be protected. Very glad to conclusively win.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the second affirmative speaker for that fine speech, and now I'd like to call upon the second negative speaker. You're here.
Clarify, I'm
Good.
Thank you.
To the team that said that we read too many useless articles, I will extend a more gracious invitation to borrow my matter file on Ethiopia after the conclusion of this debate, because President Ahmed is the first Ethiopian to win a Nobel Peace Prize. He is credited with solving the border crisis with Eritrea. He is a probably legitimate, though who knows these days, probably legitimately elected, and is certainly not facing a massive electoral crisis across the state. He has declared victory not just domestically, but to other African leaders who see him as a bastion of Western anti-colonialism, anti-colonialist sentiment, and an independent Africa, being, for instance, the second most populous country, second to Nigeria, and also the second fastest growing economy. He is a role model for many East Africans and for many outside of those borders, and he is winning this conflict. Maybe announcing that he has won it already is a bit premature, but he absolutely is going to be able to retake Tigray in the coming probably couple of months. It would be useless to burn the sorely needed capital with diplomatically and with respect to soft power, or even with respect to more stick methods of diplomacy than with carrot, with Ethiopia on something that is just not going to work. First, I'm going to explain the Nile Dam Crisis and why it is incredibly important in this debate with respect to controlling or tempering the impulses of Ethiopia. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the legitimacy of the regime and why sanctions will not affect it. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about why they just absolutely can retake Tigray, and even if they don't, why just a tiny state of a small ethnic minority surrounded by other different ethnicities and as a religious minority, not just within Ethiopia, but within the entire Horn of Africa, surrounded by enemies, is a bad place to be. And just like you don't want Tigray to be independent. Cool. On the Nile Dam Crisis, the first piece of context here is that Ethiopia is a very fast developing economy, and it would desperately like some hydropower. You're right. The Nile River Basin and its offshoot rivers do run through all of Ethiopia. We'd say that Tigray is a particularly proximate region into the borders of other states that also have access to the Nile, which is why it is geographically important. But importantly, Ethiopia would like hydropower. Importantly,
damming the Nile in areas to make hydropower viable, to get the kind of flow that you need to literally turn the turbines to make hydropower, would mean not perhaps not completely cutting off the water, but reducing flow in other parts of the Nile basin to the Nile and offshoot rivers that are in Egypt and Sudan. And in a way that would threaten their water supplies, that would threaten their agricultural sectors, that would likely cause the starvation of millions, and would cause famines for years to come. That is why, despite the fact that Tigray is a tiny Christian minority that are extremely, with a political party that is highly militarized and extremely violent to basically everybody who is not them, that is why two predominantly Muslim countries have thrown an enormous amount of backing behind the TPLF. That is why they are invested. Importantly, getting Ethiopia to back off of something that would be an economic benefit is not something you can do at the point at which you have exerted so much pressure, at the point at which you have starved their civilians, the point at which you have burned diplomatic ties with someone who is otherwise quite a good international negotiator, as evidenced by, for instance, the diffusing of the Djibouti border crisis. At the moment you do that, you cannot say, hey, please don't dam the Nile, right? And if this team wanted to stake the legitimacy of this regime and thus the effectiveness of sanctions and the ability of people who are harmed by sanctions or motivation of them to remove this regime on economic, deliverance, this would hurt Ethiopia economically, at least in the short term. You still need them to do it because otherwise millions of Sudanese and Egyptian people starve, they die, they resort to desperation. It causes massive instability in an incredibly water scarce region in the context of a changing climate. That is the most important issue, and it is one in which the West can actually have some affect. You cannot simply bar drones that are coming from China or from Iran if you are the West, because you are not the one, surprisingly in this instance, supplying them with the drones. Once it is not the US military-industrial complex, it is someone that hates them and will not do what they say. Let's talk about the legitimacy of the Ahmed regime. Will it survive pressure? Absolutely it will. How will it behave? Firstly, we say that this regime derives legitimacy from prior conflict resolution in the area and a reputation of securing a strong Ethiopia after a militarized dictatorship that was the Tigrayans, right? That was the people who are not elites, are not in power. They are hiding in the mountains at the moment. We secondly say that the Prime Minister Ahmed derives legitimacy from being a bastion of anti-colonialism. We thirdly say that he derives legitimacy from his own military service in securing the independence and prosperity of Ethiopia, putting his literal body on the line for the sake of his people, something he brings up quite often. Fourthly, we would say that the dissent is, to the extent that there is some dissent from opposition who are largely sympathetic to prior right-wing militarized regimes, can be very easily quelled. There was an election that was supposed to happen in 2020 that was postponed due to COVID. Even if that is like self-interested and dodgy, it is not entirely implausible. It can be very easily spun as I was protecting the safety of my 115 million citizens at a time when my country was ravaged by COVID. Fifthly, we would say that the regime drives international legitimacy from other African leaders in the region, but also across the continent. That helps it a lot. What do they say? Well, it derives the legitimacy from its economy. We would say, in addition to the claim that I have just made about the bigger economic concession that requires even more capital and an even more productive diplomatic relationship, that China is extremely likely to step in at the point at which there is a massive sunk cost associated with the militarization and modernization of the Ethiopian army, which has largely been backed by states like China and Iran. They will pull a Cuba, and what I mean by pull a Cuba is they will buy Ethiopian commodities, agricultural products in particular, which are the main industry in Ethiopia, which it sorely needs, at a premium to prop up a country against the harm of US embargo. Is why a nation like Cuba has been able to survive US embargo for decades now. There's massive sunk costs. It is an opportunity to distract from their own political problems in their own theater, and we say it provides a theater for proxy conflict with the United States and the West, who they have to explicitly back getting involved in this where they probably shouldn't, right? Then secondly, we'd say, again, there's a bigger economic concession at play here. You obviously need them to make that instead. So that is uniquely something you can achieve with a carrot and less of a stick approach. You can, for instance, do things like encourage FDI in that region that diversifies the economy in such a way that it does not need massive hydropower exports and does not, in fact, dam the Nile and starve Egyptians. That is something you can far more easily do, the point at which you have not said, please sacrifice something that you believe absolutely is yours, that you will probably retake anyway, that is on the border with your enemies who are trying to heavily militarize it, please and thank you. And also, please don't starve the Egyptians. Not two claims you can make at the same time. Thirdly, why they will absolutely just retake Tigray. The first thing is to say that they have militarily, that is not like they have militarily, the National Ethiopian Army captured Mekelle, which is the capital of Tigray. That meant that the Liberation Front has retreated into the mountains, rather than being an organized military. They are now resorting to guerrilla tactics. We would say increasingly they are antagonizing civilians. They are in an incredibly desperate position, point at which their attack on Addis Ababa failed and they were pushed all the way back and Mekelle was captured, which means they are coming into villages, trying to secure them, and then murdering civilians on the way out. They are very rapidly losing civilian buy-in. I'd say that thirdly, guerrilla warfare does not, in these conditions, when you have retreated to the mountains, which notably are still within the reach of drones, stack up against a highly modernized and increasingly large and populous, increasingly populated Ethiopian army, when you are literally 7% of the population. What happens if they can't retake it? You are now a tiny state surrounded by enemies, and you have outlived your usefulness as a wedge issue for Egypt and Sudan on the issue of the Nile Dam. If you at the point you can no longer do anything, they cannot pressure Ethiopia into anything. They do not care about you. You will be a tiny state controlled by a military dictatorship. People will die. So proud to oppose.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the second negatives for that fine speech. I'd now like to invite and call upon, sorry about that, the third affirmative speaker.
Hi, sorry. Can you please just stop the recording? Yeah. I just realized I have to make some controversial comments and probably not bode well with the development organization that I'm working. Okay, this is in recording. I shouldn't be saying this, but yeah.
I'm sure that can be edited out in post. If we could have the recording, please, stopped for the remaining, and I think the remainder of the debate, unless we want to redo them for the reply. But, hello. It seems like we have someone AFK. I'm just going to try and ping them real quick.
Hello, I'm sorry.
Yeah, if you could just stop and halt the recording, at least for the next two speeches, but potentially for the remainder of the debate.
Okay.
It's totally fine with neg reply to just leave it off. I would also maybe like to retain the possibility to say some controversial things. That's a joke. Sorry.
Yeah, okay,
also,
sure.
just it doesn't make sense to have replies.
I'll just pause the recording. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to conclude this negative bench on the same note with which it began, which we give you at Lulu, that the cries for secession that come from the Tigrayan people can be soothed by many other things. They can be soothed by an improvement in material conditions. They can be soothed by diversifying the economy in that area. They can be soothed by some forms of regional autonomy that do not amount to secession from the Ethiopian state. All of those that would improve material conditions and improve the day-to-day lives of Tigrayans would probably soothe all but the most warmongering, power-hungry Tigrayan militia fighters who go into Tigrayan villages and burn them down when they leave so that they cannot be occupied by Ethiopian troops. Those are the people you would not be able to convince to lay down their weapons and to accept some other kind of placation. And that is precisely why they should not be allowed to come into the power vacuum that is left at the point at which you allow 7% of your population to magically form a new state. I'm going to ask two questions in this reply. Will the secession solve Ethiopia's problems, and will it solve Tigray's problems? We'll note that this is assuming that the secession can even occur. That is not something that's necessarily proven by this team, but we will take them at their best and we will assume that it does. We identify, among others, 2 issues that Ethiopia faces at the moment. They give an additional one. What is the first? The first issue that Ethiopia has is increasing militarization and conflict on its many borders, especially with places like Sudan and Egypt, who, for instance, feel existentially threatened by their solution to the second problem that Ethiopia has, which is that it is trying to continue to spur its economic development and care for its 115 million mouths that it has to feed. The solution that they have found to that is to verge into things that existentially threaten the livelihoods and the lives at all, and threaten to extinguish the lives of people in their neighboring countries. Those are two intertwined issues that still exist. The additional problem that Ethiopia suffers under the status quo that is identified by side affirmative is that they are under the rule of a dictator. Regardless of whether you think that the Nobel Prize is an indicia of someone being a good person, I would say there's probably a higher bar for African rulers getting it than, for instance, Henry Kissinger. But irrespective, side affirmative cannot have both of these things removed, right? If they can either have secession succeed because of due pressure that is applied to this government, in which Prime Minister Ahmed stays in power because he has cowed to these demands, or they apply so much pressure and kill so many Ethiopians and starve them out that he is forced, probably in violent, bloody conflict that kills even more people, to step down. That does not seem like it solves many of Ethiopia's problems, even if secession can occur. We tell you that what would actually help is negotiating with Ethiopia on its issues from a FDI and divestment away from harmful industries approach, which, note, if we don't have the capital to do that, really unclear what affirmative have the capital to do in this way. Will this solve Tigray's problems? We identify an issue that faces the Tigrayan people at the moment. They also identify one in particular. We identify that there is an enormous amount of regional instability that is acutely affecting civilians in Tigray who are a minority and are being backed in their conflict, or rather in a particular militarized political parties conflict by two and potentially more larger powers. This creates a vacuum in that area that is either immediately taken over fully and without any opposition or without any check and balance by the bloody and warmongering Tigrayan Liberation Front, or it is taken over by an additional country who is not of their religious minority, and that would be bad. They identify the oppression of the Tigrayan people, not really explaining what it means beyond the scope of this conflict. And we say that if you end this conflict, as Ethiopia is likely to, this oppression also winds down. So proud to oppose.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the negative reply speech for their comments, and now I'd like to invite and call upon the affirmative reply speaker.
I think we all agree that the lives of these Tigrayan people matter, although some bits of negative don't, because they think a water crisis is more important. But assuming that is definitely a metric that is used to decide this debate, and we all agree that their lives are better served in a world that is secessionist, the first question we need to answer is, will the pressure for secession even work? The 5 things we told you are, number 1, we told you that a state-based economy allows us to selectively target specific individuals that comprise a large section of the state. The only response to this was trying to say that our first half said they are privatizing, which is a continuous process that hasn't happened yet, which also doesn't really respond to this analysis. So this stands. Number 2, we explained how economic hurt is something that hurts Abiy Ahmed really fundamentally, because it's its electoral promise to get back the economic prowess of the vast majority of Ethiopians. So this is something that they absolutely don't want. Their response to this was, this is just an unfair thing to put people through, because making people be hurt by virtue of this is likely to also not only be unfair to them, but create backlash. We explained why this backlash is unlikely in my speech by comparing the suffering of a privileged group and an underprivileged group, and why those who are privileged and know they can stay in positions of power, if this suffering ends, will want to reach a resolution and let the other side have what they want. This is something that went unresponded to, which is why the stuff about economic backlash is on our side. Number 3, we talked about elites and how Abiy Ahmed needs them in a time where humanitarian crisis is spreading across Ethiopia and why they're hurt. Number 4, we talked about the sheer strength of the West, why US alone imports 20% of the Ethiopian products and how the West collectively could be around 40 to 50%. The only response to this was asserting that you might pivot to China. If you look through your notes, there's no explanation of why the pivot to China is or is going to be beneficial for the regime in power, or why they can compensate for the scale the West has. And the analysis that they're missing is the active incentive of China to enter into Ethiopia and explain why they want to spend so much money during a COVID crisis. Without that analysis, the loss of the United States and the analysis we give is the analysis that definitely has more weight. All of those 4 things is fundamental to this strategy working. But the more important analysis that I gave in my speech is the incentive of Abiy Ahmed. We made him into a natural political leader that wants to keep power, not an idealistic good guy. Because, by the way, he wouldn't be killing Tigrayans if he really was a good guy that really wants peace all across the country. The first thing I said was the biggest threat to his power was the existence of powerful Tigrayans within his country. So there's an active incentive to get rid of them. The only response that existed to this is, no, there are lots of ways in which it might end up being a loss in the strength of Abiy Ahmed and the way in which he's galvanizing the country. To which we responded even preemptively by using Neg's own analysis of media narratives and how he can spin it as a win. There was no further response from their side. All of this shows that this conflict is likely to end if we push towards secession. The only response was, but these guys are winning anyway. They won't want to concede. The first thing we said against that is this conflict is unlikely to end anytime soon. This is because the conflict is perpetuated by frustrations on the other side in terms of the identity being attacked and by powerful individuals on the other side that want to get it back. All of this means that this conflict is unlikely to end. Secession is the only thing that is likely to work. Even if secession is something we can't achieve, the problem for the Tigrayans is not solved. So the alternative of we can still give them economic emancipation is unlikely to be reached at a point in time where they're within your control. So all the harms and the bad incentives apply. If this part of the debate is won, honestly, judges, everything else is less important. Nile is not near Tigray. Political capital is not a zero-sum game. And this is just not as important as saving lives. Proxy wars are better controlled when there are regions that are separate in terms of states. International actors can get more involved rather than an oppressor hiding information. Those are redundant clashes, and it's sad they hedge their case on them. Very glad to win.
Wonderful. I'd like to thank the affirmative replies. Start the recording whenever.
Started.
Yeah, we got that little beep anyway. Cool. So I'm also going to be keeping time for myself, so that's taken care of. You people are, you lovely people are free to do so as well. Cool. So this is just like the structure I'm going to follow across the course of my OA. Should be hopefully fairly clear. We give the debate to side affirmative. In a unanimous verdict, the motion stands. Why is it that we felt this way, and the structure I'm going to go ahead and explain our rationale with. I'm going to start out with a few general comments. General comments, the purpose of which is fairly simple. It's just clarity for the rest of my OA and clarity for you folks in terms of what went down in the deliberation and what our consensus was at the end of the debate. It's fairly simple in terms of just the perspective of an average, ordinary, intelligent voter going in and approaching and trying to evaluate and weighing out your content. Following which, I'll talk about the clashes in the debate. Clashes, once again, fairly simple, thematically organized, as opposed to everything and every single impact and every claim independently organized. I'm just going to club them together in large questions, hopefully making it clearer and easier and just more palatable to digest, essentially. So I'll be essentially branching them together in small little umbrellas or themes within which there are various elements. Lastly, I'll talk about a brief trade-off analysis, basically what the world looks like at the end of the debate, essentially for both sides. Good, getting straight ahead into the general comments then. I think three fairly straightforward general comments. One, and this is just IR motions in general also, but like specifically this round, we had a little trouble in terms of sorting out and evaluating and weighing out impacts, especially in terms of likelihood impacts. When I say likelihood impacts, it's things that events that are likely to occur, and therefore you're debating that this is going to happen or X impact is what it's going to lead to. I think inherently by its very nature, it's speculative, and specifically in like IR motions, geopolitics and international diplomacy makes it a little difficult because complex phenomena, multiple cause-effect relationships, you have to have a certain balance. There are holistic factors. So a single event might not necessarily be representative of the whole truth, and specific nature of tipping points and specific analysis as to why a certain event might be a tipping point. All of this in consideration made it a little difficult for us to iron out certain specific impacts and their likelihoods. I'll refer to those specifically and talk about and refer back to this general comment when I'm talking about them. Second, what the comparative essentially was in the debate is fairly clear, right? On side affirmative, you want to exert this pressure to allow this split to occur, to allow Ethiopia, or essentially have Ethiopia allow Tigray to secede, versus on side negative, you have it fairly simple in terms of create an effort to placate Tigray, which is essentially what status quo is. And they talk about in terms of their largely negative case, in terms of what else they can do and why a move to exert pressure for secession might not be a good idea for all actors involved. So this is largely what the comparative of the debate is, fairly certain outside going in. Third general comment, I think this is, and this is something the panelists and I specifically talk about, and she has specifically mentioned as well. I think how much the West cares and the degree of sphere of influence, specifically how much the West and certain specific Western actors actually care about Tigray and its relative sphere of influence in not only just Africa, but Ethiopia and Tigray specifically, is something that we could have had a little more information about, which would have made our lives a slightly bit easier, maybe the debate a little more nuanced, but like not that much of a problem in the grand scheme of things. However, we felt that it was important to mention this from the outset. Cool. General comments out of the way, I can talk about the clashes. I think given the nature of the debate, I have 5 clashes that I'd like to talk about. Once again, like I mentioned, thematically organized. I'm going to talk about the first 2 clashes and spend my bulk of my time on them because we feel like those 2 clashes are the most important part of the debate, and that's where the meat of the debate is. The rest of it sort of flows away from there. However, for the rest of the clashes, I'll mention what they were, how we interacted with that content, and how far we specifically prioritize it amongst everything else. First 2 and the most important clashes, fairly simple. 1, will Western pressure work on Ethiopia in the first place? Now, I think this was a fairly dynamic and like, this is a subject matter that went back and forth across the debate, right? In terms of will Western pressure specifically work? Now, I'll first address negatives, rebuttals, and then I'll go about how we like credit affirmatives content. Negatives, rebuttals are the following. 1, this pressure won't work because Ethiopia is going to largely win anyway. I think the reason, and when I say win, I mean win the guerrilla warfare over Tigray and probably acquire Tigray anyway. I think the fundamental reason this doesn't work or doesn't really do much to specifically address affirmatives content is that it doesn't really address that Western pressure would work in isolation or regardless of Ethiopia's influence or relative influence in Tigray, which is to say if say the Western powers packs enough of a punch or causes enough of a pinch, it's likely to make Ethiopia to fold anyway. The other rebuttals from negative were largely about the degree to which, how you prioritize the political capital, why is it that specifically should be a sticking point. All of which I'll more specifically talk about later, but in terms of why this should be the specific sticking point we need to care about, there's a healthy degree of prioritization and care in terms of why this would be the flashpoint or the most important issue to which political capital for the Western front or say the UN or largely the international community as a whole should probably care about when it comes specifically to Ethiopia. But even more specifically in terms of say other Ethiopian flashpoints, more specifically the dam, as to the relative sphere of influence the West actually has in this matter, I'm left a little uncertain as to why that would be the issue where the West should spend their hard-earned political capital or bargaining power potentially at, which is why we now move on fairly comfortably to affirmatives content in this regard as to why Western pressure would work. They have various mechanisms for them. They highlight the 5 of them through their speeches, through the reply. I'm not going to talk about all of them specifically. I'll focus on the most important thing, right? 1, the idea of the nationalized economy. That's significantly why the sanctions will work. 2, the source of power of Abiy Ahmed is largely the elite support that he gets from elite Ethiopians, which are also going to be subject to being individually targeted and therefore fairly certain as to why it would work in terms of an effort to privatize economy and Ahmed's reliance on those promises also being a specific sticking point. Also, among other reasons, they talk about the West and having leverage in the AU and yada, 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 fundamentally leading us to the conclusion why the sanctions and why these pressures will work, which I can safely accept. Which is why for this fundamental clash as to will the Western pressure work on Ethiopia, we're left on the panel as the answer of yes, and we give this clash to side affirmative. Second clash, will Tigray be pacified otherwise? Which is to say, will Tigray be okay with, say, power sharing deal, which is largely say what next side of the world or next side of the comparative looks like. I think three fundamental reasons here, right? One, the idea that the Tigrayan people and why the Tigrayan people inherently want or wish for independent statehoodness for their idea of their own cultural backing, for the political power that they've had and amassed over the years, yada, yada, yada. As to answering one part of this question, which is, yes, they do in fact want independence. Second, why the Ethiopians are likely not to hand over or not give them a share of autonomy anyway, because existing processes do work in that regard, and the Tigrayans so far have not been pacified, at which point the Ethiopians are unlikely to offer this up as a solution anyway, unless sufficient pressure is regarded. I think for this part of the comparative, this could potentially be co-opted by, say, affirmatives model, but I think for the purposes of the debate and given the team stances we took, we'll also have to say nay to this and probably give this part to the affirmative as well. The last element of which is Abiy Ahmed specifically. There was characterization as to why Abiy Ahmed would potentially have strongman tendencies, would like to have a vice grip over Tigray, would potentially benefit over saying that, hey, I've single-handedly won Tigray back, I've had unity, and potentially have political incentives in terms of the elites that support them wanting the resources in Tigray and the nationalized economy of Ethiopia having an incentive of using those resources to potentially not go ahead and give a fair share of an autonomous agreement in the first place, which is why will Tigray be pacified otherwise, and will the Tigrayan people be happy with a deal or any sort of autonomous agreement or, say, partial statehood that could be achieved? The answer is likely to be a no, but once again, this is somewhat speculative. Cool. These are the two most important clashes of the debate. I'm going to start with the rest of the three clashes remaining and probably a little bit of cleanup after. Third clash. Can Tigray withstand the aggression and sustain the secession demand, through the, say, Ethiopian aggression in the first place? Now, this is where I'll refer back to the general comments and where it gets a little complicated in terms of, say, the likelihood of the speculative analysis. Once again, fundamentally speaking, this is, of course, a dynamic situation, of course, going to be independent, that is currently ongoing. I'm not in any place to say predict or say essentially talk about what is likely to happen, nor can you sufficiently always use other examples to extrapolate what an average, ordinary, intelligent voter would probably assume as baselines in this situation, which is why this part specifically gets a little tricky for us to predict or conclusively adjudicate. However, two elements within this. One, will the Tigrayans actually last through to potentially have the Western pressure succeed? Will they even last long enough before they essentially succumb to the Ethiopian pressure? Second, what's going to happen once they're sovereign? I think I'll answer the second bit first because it's just easier, right? Once they're sovereign, there's likely to be independent safehoods, like safety valves and safeguards to protect their idea of sovereignty. This is something that's somewhat of a simplistic response, but we get from affirmative. So it's not going to be that much of a concern. At the very least, at least they want it, therefore they care about it. Also, they have reasonably the ability to take care of themselves and the economic prowess, which is why once they're sovereign is probably not the major concern in the debate. But what's more interesting and more aligned to, say, negative's challenge in this regard is, will they even last through in the first place? Specifically considering a lot of the mechanizations that we get as to the reason why the war is in fact quite so asymmetric. But fundamentally, average, intelligent, ordinary voter, asymmetric warfare. For this, say, small little skirmish or battle to be conclusively won by Ethiopia, which is what negative predicts will happen, you imagine that they would require a significant penetration into Tigray and actually acquiring Tigray property or land to a great degree. Of which, even if I were to buy the idea that asymmetric warfare and drones exist and Tigray is likely to be in the losing end, they're likely to have increased casualties and things like that, I still don't necessarily think it meets the very, very high threshold of actually winning that conflict or actually ending that conflict in a decisive victory or even a Pyrrhic victory for that matter. At which point I'm left a little uncertain as to if it meets that threshold, and potentially by the idea guerrilla warfare might not be the best, but will still be effective in terms of at least pushing back this, say, Tigrayan offensive, or potentially at least making sure that the conflict continues to exist rather than it being a decisive victory for the Ethiopians. At which point, even to this question, is it going to last through and is it potentially just going to be a matter of months? I find it unlikely. While I'm not necessarily in a place to predict, I think the threshold, at least in a debate format, required to achieve that is not something I can conclusively give to neg either. Fourth and fifth clash, fairly simple. One, African sentiment and how African sentiment is going to play out in terms of A, dam, B, the dynamics that exist within. For B, the dynamics that exist within, once again, uncertain if I meet the threshold of Egypt and Sudan, potentially it being a flashpoint for them. For the dam per se, we already agree that, and this is contributions that I get, that the dam would likely move forward regardless of what the West has to say. Not really certain as to why West specifically cares about that dam in the first place, or the dam existing. Not really certain as to why specifically the Tigray conflict causes a halt in the dam and the process of the dam being built, apart from the fact that it's a major conflict in the region. I don't see any specific reason in terms of the dam, say, physical location, or the dam where the water flows and upstream and shit like that, in terms of why it's going to be a concern that Tigray, the land of Tigray, is now not going to be with Ethiopia anymore, to put it that way. Which is to say, African sentiment and them halting it is not going to be quite so much as a concern in debate. The last idea is that of proxy wars and its harm. Once again, two things. I think this was impacted out to a certain degree, at which point, while I'm not comfortable giving it to AF, at least I think it's a wash in terms of how harmful proxy wars are going to be, or the likelihood that proxy wars wouldn't happen in the first place anyway. But secondly, I think proxy wars are predicated or contingent on the idea that certain amount of arms or certain amount of military action is taken by the West, specifically in Tigray, of which also have a certain little bit of question mark, because yes, Neck points out that it's likely to get violent. But once again, the larger clashes prove that it's likely not to be that quick of a timeline or that short of a timeline, and it's likely not going to be quite so violent, at which point we're left with a little bit of a question mark here as well. So even if I don't give this clash to affirmative per se, at the very best, it's a wash, certainly not enough of a harm to overtake everything else that exists in the debate. Moving on to a quick trade-off analysis. Negative, what does neg world look like? They're probably unlikely to placate like the Tigrayans. Ethiopia might or might not fold in terms of their idea of actually building their dam, and probably still have it made anyway, which is what and in contrary, affirmative this world looks like you're likely to get some positive traction, specifically on the secession process, and at the very least have a discussion going in that vein. Cool. I think that's me done for my OA. You can probably get forward to any questions. Affirmative, any questions?
No, all good. Thank you.
Cool. Negative?
I'm good. How about you, Connor? Lulu?
Yeah, we might, if it's all right, we could happily grab some feedback later. We might just need to have a quick next round, but thank you so much.
No question in the OA right now. For personal feedback, please feel free to approach me, probably like Messenger or Discord. You can find me by my name, ping me there. Feel free to talk to the panelists as well. They were an active and helpful part of the deliberation. So yeah, best of luck, guys, for the rest of your rounds. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Best of luck,
Bye.
guys. It was a great debate to adjudicate.